So when I was in college, I worked for an individual who owned his own construction business. He attended the church where our family attended. He was friends with my parents, and my older brother worked for him year-round, full-time. And when I was home for a couple years on Christmas break and summer break, he hired me to work on his crew. He had no business hiring me, and he probably just did it as a favor to my parents because I think I ended up costing him more money than I actually made him. I was not good at what I did, and I learned that on the first day real quick. So the first job that we were doing, I was a freshman home from school for Christmas break, mid-December. The job he was getting started on was redoing a roof in somebody's home. And it ended up snowing the night before, like on a Sunday night. We were going to go on the job on Monday, and I remember it snowed like 6-7 inches. I remember thinking to myself, we're not going to work tomorrow, right? Because there's all this snow that's going to be on the roof. Like, how are you going to redo a roof with snow on the roof? And I go to my brother, who works for him year-round, and I say, we're not working tomorrow, right? And he just goes, ha! He laughs at me. Yes, we are going to be working tomorrow. They will remove the snow from the roof. It's like, got it. So we show up to the job site. I step out of the car, and right away I know that I'm in big trouble because I'm wearing jeans, some hiking boots, and just like a regular winter jacket. And I look at what the whole crew is wearing, and they're decked out in like insulated, heavy-duty winter wear, construction stuff. They've got their tool belts on, like steel-toed boots that are insulated, overalls with big, heavy jackets on. I'm like, I am going to freeze. I could just tell. Now, when you work a construction site, the expectation is you have your own tools. You bring your own tools. I had 0 tools. And so they said, here's what you get to do today. You get to clean up all the shingles that we scrape off the roof, put them in the dumpster, and then you get to hoof shingles from the ground to the roof so we can lay them down. So all day I just cleaned up mess, and I brought shingles up. I cleaned up mess, and I brought shingles up. And there was this moment where I was like walking up the ladder, and I've got a thing of shingles. I throw it down, and this guy named Mark, he's like the foreman. He asks me to go get him a certain type of saw in the garage. He needs to cut this thing that's up there. And he says, go get this saw and bring it to me. I look at him, and I think to myself, I don't know what that is. And instead of asking a clarifying question because I was so embarrassed, I just walked down the ladder thinking to myself, I don't know what I'm supposed to get. Like, I go to the garage, and I'm like, I have no idea what this tool is. And I look at all the tools in front of me, and I'm just like, I'm going to grab this one and hope that it's right. And I get it, and I go back up the ladder, and I hand it to him. He's like, that's not at all what I asked for. And I was like, sorry. And he's like, you don't know what I'm asking for, do you? I'm like, I have no idea. He's like, go get this. It looks like this. I go get it. We move along the day. After lunch, there's one part of the roof that needs some nails pulled out of it. They scraped all the shingles off, but there's nails still sticking out. And they said, hey, Brian, we want you to here's this hammer. Since you don't have a hammer, you can borrow mine. And we want you to either pound the nails down or pull them out so we can clear this spot and keep going. So I'm pounding and pulling. With my borrowed hammer, there's one nail that I just can't get. And this same guy, Mark, is right next to me. And I noticed earlier in the day, he had this tool that was really great with getting nails out. It's called a cat's paw. It looks like this. I didn't know what it was called. And so I said, hey, Mark, can I borrow your nail getter-outer thingy just for a second? And he's like, you mean my cat's paw? And I'm like, yeah, that thing. And so he let me borrow it. I gave it back, and we moved on. But all day, it felt like every time I turned around, I was saying something stupid. I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do. I was making mistakes all the way around, and I was cold, wet, and miserable. And the only saving grace at the end of the day was they felt so bad for me that the next day, somebody brought me an insulated, one-piece jumpsuit to wear, so at least I wouldn't be cold. And I wonder if anybody has ever been in a similar situation where you just feel in over your head. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know why I'm doing this. I feel wildly unqualified to do the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. Anybody ever been there before? Yeah, we all have moments where we feel wildly unqualified to do what we're being asked to do. Now, our hope for our church through this series and beyond is that we would become a community of kingdom storytellers who can pay attention and participate with what God is doing in their life, ultimately so that we can find ways to share that story with those who don't know Jesus. And what I know to be true so far in this series is that there are probably people here who feel wildly unqualified to share their story with other people. And it could be because you're like, I don't even know how to make sense of my own story, and now you're asking me to go share that with others. Some people have told me, I feel like I don't have a story. When I look back on my Christian life, it's just always been there. I don't have this dramatic conversion moment where I'm on the brink of death, throwing my life away, living in a gutter, and God redeemed me, and now my life is fine. I don't have that story. And some people probably feel like this idea of sharing their story about what Jesus is doing is probably me pushing religion on people, and I don't want to feel sleazy that way. I imagine there's a lot of people here this morning who feel that way, who feel unqualified, ill-equipped to share the story of what God has done and is doing in your life. And in order to help people feel confident and competent in knowing their story, to share their story, we've created a real simple pathway that we believe helps people get to that point where they have a story to tell. We've been talking about this each week. 5 steps on this pathway that starts with hearing God. Knowing that God is regularly, continually communicating and speaking with you. And if you posture yourself in a way to hear from him, he will do all sorts of things and say all sorts of things into your life. And then from there, it's knowing God's story and knowing your own story and knowing how God's story actually is the overarching umbrella for your story. And then it comes from being with God, learning how to love God and love others, ultimately to be in a position where there's a door open for you to tell the story of who God is and what he's doing in your life. And so this week we're leaning into this idea of being with God. What does it mean to be with Jesus, and how does that enable us and empower us to be kingdom storytellers? And we're going to look at this through the lens of the book of Mark, specifically Mark chapter 3 and Mark chapter 6. And so we're going to be in Mark 3, looking at verse 13 in just a moment. Now, when Mark's story opens up, Mark jumps right into the action of Jesus' life and ministry. Meaning in Mark's gospel, there's no birth narrative, there's no backstory, there's no genealogy. It's just less than half of a chapter in, and Jesus' ministry is in motion in full force. Jesus gives his inaugural message in chapter 1, verse 15. It's just a summary of what Jesus was proclaiming at that time. From there, he calls a few followers, and then he starts to travel all around the region of Galilee, which is northern Israel, and he's doing 2 things. Those 2 things is, 1, Jesus is preaching the gospel. He's preaching about the kingdom. And then 2, he's healing anybody who has any sickness or disease. And by the time you hit chapter 3, word is out about Jesus, and crowds are coming from far, far away to be near him and be around him and to hear him and hopefully be healed by him. People are starting to follow him around everywhere he goes. And by the time we hit chapter 3, Jesus makes a decisive move. We're told that there's a large crowd of people. Jesus is ministering around the Sea of Galilee, and we're told that people are coming from all over Israel to hear him teach. They're coming from Tyre and Sidon in the north. They're coming from Idumea in Jerusalem, in Judea in the south. They're coming from east of the Jordan River just to be around Jesus. And after being swarmed by a group of people in the first part of Mark chapter 3, we read that Jesus does this in verse 13. It says, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted. And they came to him. And he appointed 12 that they may be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. And then these are the 12 he appointed. And then it goes on and it lists all the names of the 12 men who would become his initial disciples, who we now refer to as the apostles. Now, what's remarkable about this moment is that the individuals that Jesus chooses are people whom society would have deemed unqualified for this task, which means if you are feeling overwhelmed and unqualified about the idea of sharing your story of who Jesus is and what he's doing in your life, the good news is you're in good company. Because we see regularly and repeatedly throughout the Gospels is that Jesus calls the unqualified. Jesus calls those who are not necessarily qualified, who don't have the credentials for the task. And understanding first century Jewish education helps highlight how Jesus has called the unqualified. There's 3 levels to first century Jewish education. In some ways, you might think that mirrors the 3 levels of our primary education of elementary school, middle school, and high school. They're not equivalent, but there are 3 stages and 3 steps. And the first step or stage of Jewish education was known as Bet Sefer. Now, Bet is just the word for house. Sefer means book. And so this first level of education was also known to be the book of learning. Now, education started for young kids at the age of 6. And this first step, this first stage in their education went from age 6 to age 10. They would go to a local synagogue, they would be taught by a local rabbi, and the content of their teaching was the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They focused on those 5 books, and the goal in those first initial 5 years was to memorize those 5 books. Like, people didn't have their own copy of the first 5 books of the Bible. Printing things wasn't a thing. So in order to learn and retain something, you pretty much had to memorize it. Now, once they hit age 10, for most of the kids, their education was done. They finished school. They then went back and learned the family business and learned the family trade. Graduation has to come upon them at 10 years old. But for those who were the best of the best, the top of the class, the cream of the crop, a local rabbi would come to them and invite them into the second level of education, and that was known as Bet Talmud, which means house of learning. This age group would go from age 10 to 14, and the focus of this stage in their education, being taught by a local rabbi at a local synagogue, was the rest of the Old Testament. The goal was to memorize as much as you could of the rest of the Old Testament, the historical books, Psalms, Proverbs, all the prophets. That was the hope. And again, only the best of the best would do that. Now, once they hit 14, they were then done with school and went back to learn the family business, learn the family trade. And if an individual thought that they had what it takes to go to level 3, they would then approach a rabbi, and they would ask a rabbi, hey, can I be your student? Can I be your disciple? And this was known as, the third stage was known as Bet Midrash, which means house of study. And if the rabbi looked at this student and thought that they might have what it takes, he would invite them to be his student. If not, he would dismiss them, and they would then go learn the family trade. But it was through a series of examinations and tests. He would grill them to see if they had what it takes. And if so, he would invite them to be his student. You would leave home and you would travel with this rabbi going wherever he goes in order to learn everything he knows, ultimately to become like him. The goal of the Jewish education system was basically to filter everybody out, to find out who could be rabbis that would carry on the tradition of the Torah. So when Jesus chooses these 12 men, who are primarily fishermen, who have learned the family business and have learned the family trade, he is gathering those who are unqualified to be a rabbi, unqualified to follow a rabbi, to try and become like the rabbi. Basically, Jesus goes and gathers all the college dropouts and says, hey, come, be my student, be my disciple. Jesus is choosing those who can't hack it, who can't cut it, who don't have what it takes, which highlights that Jesus isn't looking for the best of the best. Jesus isn't looking for the top of the class. Jesus isn't looking for those who have credentials and have been around the block and who know it all. And it's highlighted by what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1. Paul says, "But God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of this world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." See, Jesus isn't looking for perfection. If you're feeling overwhelmed by the idea of knowing your story to share your story with others, specifically with people who don't know Jesus, it's okay if you feel overwhelmed. It's okay if you feel unqualified. It's okay if you feel like you're out of your league and you're sinking in the deep end, because Jesus can work with that. He's not looking for perfection. What Jesus desires is simply participation. Participation in his ministry, in his work, the work that he is doing in your life. Jesus desires participation. Now, notice here what Jesus is calling these disciples to. It says in verse 14 that he called them to be his students so that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. I mean, that is a weighty task. That is a huge thing, to go preach and to drive out demons. And what's interesting about this moment is that Jesus is simply inviting them in to do what he has already been doing. Like, if you read through chapters 1 and 2 of Mark, that's all Jesus is doing. He's traveling around and he's teaching and he's preaching about the kingdom of God, and then he's healing anybody who has any sickness or disease. In the first 2 chapters, there's 4 specific references to Jesus teaching, and there's about 4 or 5 different stories of Jesus healing. And the way that Jesus brings his disciples into participating in his ministry is through this regular calibration of invitation and challenge. Jesus is regularly inviting people into relationship with him and then challenging them to pick up kingdom responsibility. And in this moment, that's what he's doing. He's inviting them to follow him, to go where he goes, to do the things that he's doing. You will see this explicitly play out in chapter 6, this rhythm of invitation and challenge. And my guess is anybody who is currently raising kids or who has raised kids, you actually lead your kids in a very similar way, because you want your kids to have relationship with you. You want your kids to be adults who want to be around you. You want to nurture relationship with your kids. You also want to teach them responsibility. I don't want my girls at 35 years old still living in my house. Like, I want them to be gone. That means I have to teach them the responsibility of what it means to manage things, to keep track of things, to take care of themselves. I'm constantly calibrating with my kids invitation and challenge. Invitation to relationship and challenge to responsibility, namely in this context, kingdom responsibility. And I'm convinced that Jesus is doing the same with you. He may not be calling you to go preach on a street side somewhere or heal somebody who has a disease, but I'm confident and convinced that Jesus is at work in your life. He says so in John chapter 5. To this very day, he says, "My Father is always at work, so I too am always at work." Our assumption is that Jesus is always present and always at work in your life. His desire is that you would participate with him in the work that he's doing in you, so ultimately he might be able to do it through you. And part of that responsibility that we believe you have is to steward the story of what God has done and is doing in your life. Stewardship of your own story is a wildly significant kingdom responsibility, because his desire is that you would be able to tell the story. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story, it says in Psalm 107, verse 2. Now, the beautiful thing about Jesus is as he calibrates invitation and challenge, he does desire that people would participate in his ministry. He does desire that people would do the work of the kingdom in their everyday life. But Jesus isn't just a taskmaster trying to use people. Jesus knows that doing for the kingdom flows from being with him. And that's why Jesus, even though he desires participation in the work of his ministry, he ultimately prioritizes being over doing. And you see that in three specific ways in Mark 3 and Mark 6. And it starts with the call of these 12 men, because Jesus does call them to go out to preach about the kingdom and heal every sickness and disease. But before that, their primary call is this, verse 14. If we back up just a few words to the beginning of the verse, he appointed the 12 that they might be with him. The thing that Jesus wants is for you to be in relationship with him. He desires more than anything else that you would prioritize being with him more so than doing things for him. Kingdom responsibility is certainly a part of discipleship. But if it doesn't flow from being with Jesus, it's just spiritual activity with no anchor point in connectivity, specifically with Jesus. And what I wonder is whether or not a lot of Christians are actually looking to Jesus just to receive things from him rather than prioritize being with him. We just want to receive things from Jesus. We want Jesus to save us. We want him to deal with our problems. We want him to bless us. I want to show up at church on Sunday morning because it's a comfortable place and I can put my kids in childcare and I can have a warm cup of coffee and have an hour to myself. I want these things from him. But what Jesus really wants is you to be in relationship with him. I don't know exactly what year it was. Might have been like way back in the 60s. Shel Silverstein wrote a book called The Giving Tree. Anybody remember this story? It's a story about a young boy who has this tree in his community that every day he goes and he plays around this tree. He climbs the tree. He swings in its branches. He rests under the shade of the tree. He falls in love with this tree. The boy loves the tree, and the tree loves the boy. Time goes on, and this boy gets older. He grows up. He meets a girl. He goes off into the world, and he does things. And every once in a while, he comes back to this tree. And he's a young adult at this point, and he comes back to the tree, and the tree's excited to see him, and the tree invites him to play. But the boy says, no, I don't have time to play. I'm doing all these things. What I need money. Do you have any money in your branches, tree? And the tree says, I have no money, but I have apples. And you can take my apples, and you can sell them, and you can go make money. So the boy climbs up into the tree. He takes all the apples from the tree, and he goes and he sells them, and he makes money. Time goes by, and this boy drifts away from the tree again, and then he becomes a married man with a family, and he comes back to the tree, and the tree is so excited to see the boy, and he says, oh, come play with me. And he says, I'm way too busy to play. I have a family. I've got young kids, and what I need is a house. Do you have a house for me, tree? And the tree says, no, I don't have a house, but I have all these branches, and you can cut down my branches, and you can take them with you to go build a house. And so the boy, who's now a young man, takes all the branches and goes to build a house. He lives the rest of his life through his working years. He then retires, and he comes back to the tree, and he's a bit older now, and the tree is so excited to see him. He's just a trunk of a tree at this point. And he says to this boy, let's spend some time together. And the boy says, who's again now a grown man, I'm retired. I want to go and I want to sail on the seas and enjoy my retirement. I'm looking for a boat. Do you have a boat for me? And the tree says, I don't have a boat, but you can cut down my trunk and you can go make a boat and go sail away. And so he does. Through the course of his life, the boy has taken everything from the tree, the fruit, the branches, the trunk. Then eventually he comes back around as an old man to find that all that is left is the stump. And he sits on the stump to rest. And what's interesting as the story goes on, every time the tree gives something to the boy, it says, and the tree was happy. The tree was happy to give the fruit, the branches, and the trunk. And then you get to the end, it says, and the tree was happy, but not really. Because what the tree wanted was this relationship with the boy, but the boy just wanted to use the tree. And what I think with God is that he's actually happy to do the things for us that we desire. He's happy to bless us with things. He's happy to do all of these things because he is a good father, and a good father wants to give good gifts to his kids. But the thing that the Father desires more than anything else is relationship. And I think sometimes we go to Jesus and we use Jesus for what he can do for us, and we don't prioritize simply being with him, knowing that that's our greatest joy. There's a move in this story of the giving tree from a boy who enjoys a tree to a grown man who just uses the tree. And I think for many of us, we first meet Jesus and we enjoy Jesus, and we're infatuated with who he is and what he has done, but over time, we drift. And we just use Jesus for what he can do for us. But the true enjoyment is found in being with him. And what he desires is this: he does desire our participation, that we would work alongside him for the sake of the kingdom. But primarily, he wants us to enjoy relationship with him. And the question is, are we doing that? Are we prioritizing just being with Jesus so that we can enjoy him, trusting that whatever Jesus calls us to do will flow out of that? Like, one of the things I wonder is if you're in a stage of life like me where it's hard to find a moment of quiet in the morning, because as soon as your feet hit the floor, it's like, hey, we got to get the kids out the door for school. I got to get off to work. I got to do all these things. What if you could find a 5-minute moment in your day where you just prioritize being with Jesus? And I'm not even saying you have to read your Bible, you have to open it up, you have to accomplish something with God. I'm just saying, what would it be like just to be and to say, Jesus, I'm here. To trust that the Spirit isn't dwelling in you and you can just be with him for 5 minutes. If it's driving to and from work, if you have a dog and you have to walk your dog daily, go on a walk with your dog and say, Jesus, I'm just here. Help me to have awareness. Help me to learn how to hear from you in all things in my life, so that my awareness of your presence increases, so that no matter what I'm doing or where I'm going, I'm aware that you are with me. That's what Jesus desires most, is that we would be with him and commune with him so that our relationship would grow deep with him. And not only does Jesus call his disciples to be with him, he also models the importance of it. If we go back to chapter 1, verse 35, Jesus spent a day ministering to people, healing people. And the next morning, we're told in verse 35, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. This is a regular practice for Jesus. 9 times throughout the Gospels, you can find moments where Jesus is pulling away by himself to pray. We're told in Luke 5, verse 16, that Jesus often went by himself to pray. Jesus is modeling for his disciples what it means to prioritize being with God, the Father, in Jesus, more so than it is trying to accomplish and do things for him. And not only does Jesus model this in the book of Mark, but Jesus tries to lead his disciples to that place as well. Jesus calls them in chapter 3 to be his specific disciples. Then as you move through the rest of chapter 3 into 4 and into 5, Jesus is still doing those two things. Chapter 4 is all Jesus teaching. It's parables that Jesus taught. Chapter 5 is another 2 to 3 stories of Jesus healing people who are sick and ill. And then at the start of chapter 6, Jesus sends his disciples out. It's like, you've been with me, you've seen this, you've done this, now go out and go do these things. In chapter 6, verse 7, it says, Jesus sent them out with his authority to preach about the kingdom and to heal every sickness and disease. And then in verse 30 of chapter 6, they come back. But as it is with Jesus, he's swarmed with people. It says there's so many people there that they couldn't even get a quiet moment to eat. And so we see in verse 31, Jesus says this. He says, come with me by yourself to a quiet place and get some rest. Jesus is trying to retreat with his disciples just to be with them, so they can report about all the things they did. This is within the calibration of invitation and challenge. This is Jesus inviting these 12 to relationship, retreat, and rest with him. So they get away. They're probably around the Sea of Galilee. They hop in a boat. They're trying to travel to the other side of the Sea of Galilee to be by themselves. And the crowd that's with them notices, like, Jesus is going. He's on the move. And as they do, they follow. So when Jesus gets out of the boat on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, there is this crowd waiting for him that is basically hijacking his spiritual retreat he's trying to have with his disciples. And it says that Jesus looked at this crowd and he had compassion on them. Jesus allowed himself to be interrupted by this needy crowd, and once again, spent the day teaching and probably healing. And the disciples are eager to get away with Jesus, but once again, he's giving of himself to people. And we read in verse 35, by this time it was late in the day, so the disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. You got to wonder, are the disciples getting annoyed at this point? Like, we've been giving all these things away, Jesus. We've been doing all this stuff for you. We just want to have a quiet moment with you, and this crowd interrupts us. Just send them away so they can go get something to eat. See, Jesus desires people to be with him because Jesus also empowers the impossible when we just simply spend time with him. Because what he says to the disciples in this moment when they say, hey, go send this group away so they can go buy something to eat, Jesus says in verse 37, you give them something to eat. Jesus here is calibrating invitation and challenge. He's inviting them to relationship and retreat, but in this moment, he's also challenging them to take up kingdom responsibility by saying, don't send them away to go get something to eat. You give them something to eat. We're told that there's probably 5,000 plus people here. Imagine being the disciples and being like, Jesus, what are you saying? Like, how do we do that? I mean, if I told one of you in this room to feed everybody in this room, and this is maybe 150 people, you'd be like, Brian, how do I do that? I don't have time. I don't have the resources. I don't know how to cook anything. And you can feel that the disciples are sitting in the weight of this, like, Jesus, what in the world are you saying? They say to him, that would take more than a half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? And then they say, how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. Go and see. When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. In John's gospel, when we read this story, we read that Jesus said this, you give them something to eat, only to test them, because he already knew what he was going to do. That he already had in mind what he planned to do. See, when you spend time with Jesus, when you calibrate his invitation and challenge with you, he empowers the impossible in your life because all of this work is his work. Like, he's the one in charge. He's the one who's sovereign over all. He's inviting us into it, but it's not our work. We don't have to take on the ultimate weight of it because Jesus already knows what he's going to do. Jesus is the one who is in control. Jesus wants to do things in you so that he can do them through you, but ultimately it's his work. And what we learn in this moment is that being with Jesus empowers our participation. Because after they gather these 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, Jesus gives thanks, breaks the bread, and just says to the disciples, pass it out. Let everybody eat as much as they want and more. And then there was 12 baskets of leftovers. The disciples got to participate with Jesus and doing something incredible because they had prioritized being with him, cultivating a relationship, and they got to see amazing things take place. But the starting point for all of that is being with him. Being with Jesus empowers our participation. He already knows what he's going to do. He's already at work. He's already doing things all over the place in your life and the lives of the people around you. So why not just open your eyes? Why not say yes? Why not prioritize being with him so you can pay attention to what he's doing and then participate when he says go? Why not? What do you have to lose? What I think will start to happen in your life, if you live that way, is that other people will start to notice that there's something different about you and the way you're living and where it's coming from. You see this clearly in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 3, Jesus has raised from the dead. He's ascended back to the Father. The Spirit has come. The church is born. And this group of new believers living in Jerusalem, gathering anybody who wants to be a part of what they're doing, worshiping, living, and praying together every day. They're on their way to the temple to pray. And Peter and John see this guy begging outside the temple. We're told that he's lame. He's never used his legs. And Peter says, hey, I don't have any money, but what I do have is better. Get up and walk and come join us in the temple. And the guy stands up for the first time in his life, uses his feet, walks into the temple, jumping and leaping and praising God. And everybody sees this lame beggar now walking. And Peter knows, I've got their attention. And he starts to preach the gospel. Again, he's doing the two things that he saw Jesus do his whole ministry: heal those who are sick and preach the word. Now, the Pharisees are there, and they don't like what they're seeing. They're bothered by this Jesus movement taking ground in their city, especially after he is no longer around. So the Pharisees arrest Peter and John and take them into custody. Chapter 4 of Acts is the trial under which they go. And they go back and forth on trial. Peter and John refute the claims of the Pharisees. And there comes this moment where the Pharisees stop. And this is what we read of their reaction, of who these men are, what they have done, and why they have done it. This is Acts chapter 4, verse 13. It says, when they, the Pharisees, saw the courage of Peter and John and realized they were unschooled, ordinary men. They couldn't hack it. They got kicked out of rabbi school. College dropouts who Jesus called. When they realized they were ordinary men, they were astonished. And they took note that these men had been with Jesus. The things that they were doing, the impossible of sharing the story of God publicly, healing sickness and disease, came from a place of having prioritized being with Jesus. Our hope is that you become a kingdom storyteller. Again, you may not preach on street corners, you may not stand on stages, but our hope is that you would have awareness of God's activity in your life. That you would know what he's doing, you would know how he's working, you have eyes to see and ears to hear and a heart that's willing to respond. You would know he's not looking for perfection, he simply wants your participation. And the starting point for that participation is relationship with him. Just being with him, trusting that he will lead you into what might feel overwhelming, might feel impossible. It might feel as though I'm ill-equipped and unqualified. But Jesus will take care of that if you're open, if you're obedient, and you trust him along the way. So what does it look like to be with Jesus for you in your daily life? Are you willing to participate with him in whatever he's putting in front of you? And are you expectant that being with Jesus empowers the impossible in your life? Lord, we thank you so much for who you are. We thank you so much for all that you have done through your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you for the love that you have for us, the story that you are writing in our lives. And I pray, Lord, that we would have eyes to see, that we would be people who are quick to respond and participate with you. But primarily, Lord, I ask that we would prioritize just being with you, to enjoy you, to be in relationship with you, to ultimately rest in the goodness of your mercy, in your love. Amen.